Hello and good evening. Welcome to Expanding the Palette of Jewish Representation, One Pirate at a Time, which is the last event in this year's 2026 Diverse Perspectives in Digital Media and Design Speaker Series, hosted by the Department of Digital Media and Design at the University of Connecticut. To paraphrase James Baldwin, nothing can be changed until it is faced. This is certainly true of the inequities that have historically shaped our digital media environments, both on screen and behind the scenes. We are honored that tonight's event is co-sponsored by UConn Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life. We would like to begin today's event by acknowledging that the land on which we gather here in Storrs, Connecticut, is the home of the Mohegan, Manchatucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Sicatacoke, Golden Hill Pagussit, Nipmuc, and Lenape peoples who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. For our virtual audience, please do take advantage of the YouTube chat box to submit questions for our guests so that we include them in our discussion. I'm Heather Elliott Familaro, and I'm a digital artist, documentary filmmaker, and the department head for digital media and design at UConn. DMD is a young department founded in 2013, which has rapidly grown to over 350 undergraduate and graduate students and 26 full-time faculty. We have 7 undergraduate concentrations across the full digital media spectrum: film production, animation, interactivity, business, and the humanities at both the Storrs and Stanford campuses. In our department, we value and celebrate our students' diverse backgrounds, and we support their development both as individuals and as professional media creators. Now in its 4th year, Diverse Perspectives in Digital Media and Design Speaker Series is one celebration of these shared values. Now, on to the show. It's my extreme pleasure to welcome today's co-host, Professor Clarissa Seglio, DMD students Leah Wallerman, William Hodges, and Cam Vieira. Clarissa Seglio, hi Clarissa, is a cultural historian trained in the interdisciplinary field of American studies. She works at the intersections of museum studies, public history, and digital humanities. And this means that she researches how museums past and present have sought to engage their publics in issues of civic concern. And she also collaborates with museums, archives, and communities on interdisciplinary public-facing projects designed to engage, educate, and empower.
Thanks so much, Heather. I can't believe this is the finale of season 6.
It's crazy. So next we've got Leah Wallerman. She's a digital media and design student at the University of Connecticut, specializing in motion design and animation. An artist based in New Jersey, her design interests greatly vary, including but not limited to 2D and 3D animation, digital drawing, motion graphics, UI UX design, and graphic design. She also interned at the advertising agency Havas Health over the summer, where she gained valuable skills in brand strategy and marketing. She is currently working on her untitled senior project that uniquely explores themes of letting go of bad people, even if they once were your greatest friends. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you.
And next we've got William Hodges, a digital media and design major here at UConn with a concentration in film and video. He's a social media content creator, artist, audio engineer, and independent filmmaker who works with upcoming musicians around the country. And while doing this, he is pursuing a BFA in cinematic filmmaking. In 2025, William released Gas Tank, a cinematic music video that was shot in Los Angeles, along with making the song too. In 2026, he's hoping to release both music and videos with bigger musicians in the industry and continuing to get his brand promoted more. Thanks for being here, William.
Thank you.
And we've got Cam, a digital media and design major here at UConn with a concentration also in film and video. He's an aspiring filmmaker with a strong interest in storytelling, especially narratives that connect multiple characters and perspectives into one larger story. Along with his academic work, Cameron explores creative projects that focus on character development, action, and narrative structure. He is currently working towards a BFA degree, continuing to build his skills in filmmaking and visual storytelling. Thank you, Cameron. Welcome.
Thank you.
And now I will turn the virtual mic over to you, Clarissa, to introduce our special guest today.
Thanks, Heather. And it really is my pleasure as a longtime graphic novel reader and film watcher to introduce today's guest. Arnon Z. Shorr is a filmmaker and author of fantastical stories that embrace the peculiar, where encounters with the strange reveal who we are. His screenplays include a Page finalist and a Launchpad Top 50, and his swashbuckling graphic novel, Jose and the Pirate Captain Toledano, is an expansion of his award-winning short film about Jewish pirates in the 16th century Caribbean. He is a 2024 Fellow of the JWI Screenwriters Lab, a 2024-25 Fellow of the PJ Library Shepherdic Stories Initiative, and an MFA candidate in the inaugural cohort of the groundbreaking creative writing program at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, and he lives in Massachusetts, a former hometown state. Welcome, Arnon.
Thank you very much. I just tried to hit Alt-A, which is supposed to unmute me, and it didn't, so I had to click the button. Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
And I encourage everyone on Zoom to please check out the chat, where you will find links not only to our student co-hosts' work, but also, of course, the many places you can learn more about Arnon and access his work as well. And our event tonight is going to start with a special screening of his short film, The Pirate Captain of Toledano. If you've got the popcorn nearby, go get it. And Arnon, any words that you'd like to offer by way of introduction, or should we jump right in?
Well, I'm glad to be here. I don't really have any words of introduction except to say that I'm excited to share the film with you and to talk about it. When we do get around to chatting, I'd like to be as much of an open book as possible. I know we've got a lot of students listening in or tuning in or watching. So come up with your questions and lob them at me.
All right, well, let us begin with the special screening of this short film.
Captain.
What is it?
Sir, we have a stowaway.
Oh? You know what to do.
Well, he wants to speak with you.
Show me. Where do you come from, stowaway?
When the captain asks a question, the boy will answer or die.
Where did you sneak aboard my ship?
San Pedro.
That was 2 weeks ago.
What do you want?
I want to become a pirate.
Don't laugh. He eluded all of you for 2 weeks. Survived below eating rats and drinking his own piss in one of the fight. You impress me, Stowaway. But you waited too long to come out of hiding. At dawn, we will intercept the Spanish gold fleet. They won't be expecting us.
That's perfect. I can fight with you.
The last thing I need is you underfoot.
I can swing a sword.
You can swing a sword. You'll be swinging from the yard arm, stowaway.
Drop it. Get rid of him.
Ho!
You thief! Wait a moment.
That's mine.
Who did you steal this from?
I didn't steal it. It's mine.
Use your next breath with great care.
It's all I have left. It was my father's.
Throw him in the brig. I'll deal with him later.
But I...
The brig!
Let's go. No! No, please! No, it was my father! Hey. I know what you're doing tomorrow. I can help. I want to fight the Spanish too.
It is not about the Spanish boy. It is about the gold.
Hey, you! Come up here.
Aye, Capitan.
יום השישי, ויחולו השמיים והארץ, וכל צבאם. ויכל אלוהים ביום השביעי, מלאכתו אשר עשה. וישבות ביום השביעי, מכל מלאכתו אשר עשה. ויברך אלוהים את יום השביעי, ויקדש אותו, כי בו שבת מכל מלאכתו, אשר ברא אלוהים לעשות. סברים ארנן, ברוך אתה אדוני, אלוהינו מלך העולם, בורא פרי הגפן.
Scusi te, amica. Io expulso de Toledo.
Mi rayos de faro.
Torquemada. Quemada avi al poste. I heard the guard tell you that it's not about the Spanish. You and I, we know different. You are my prisoner this night. You are a stowaway. Stowaways must be punished, you understand? When the sun rises tomorrow, you will fight by my side as my brother. Shabbat Shalom.
All right, I sent them a note and told them they can cut off the end credits a little bit because that list just keeps going and going because so many people were involved in making this thing. Clarissa, you are still muted, so I can't hear you much as I'd like to.
It's not an official part of the series unless we have a few human moments. And speaking of beautiful human moments, what I'd like to do is to remind our YouTube audience, whether it's questions about the short film that you just saw, or as our co-hosts lead Arnon in discussion, please post your questions to chat. And with that, I will turn it over to Cam to get our discussion started. Thank you.
Okay. I'm Cam. It's really nice to meet you. So, the title of your talk tonight is expanding on the palette of Jewish representation, one pirate at a time. So, tell us about the state of Jewish representation in popular media and why you decided to tackle this in your creative work.
All right. How many hours do we have? The state of Jewish representation in popular media is a complicated moving target. But broadly speaking, I usually like to do this in a room full of people where I can actually hear folks. But if you sort of close your eyes and think about all the media that you've consumed, all the stuff you've watched, and you think of the times that you've encountered Jewish characters, what do those characters look like? What do they sound like? What jobs do they have? What personality traits do they have? What do you see? What do you come up with? If people have ideas, I'd love to see them in the chat.
I can say one out loud. I think
Please.
of the marvelous Mrs. Maisel,
Hmm.
where you have a range of nervous individuals, repressed individuals. And then I also think of the many films where the person of Jewish ancestry is the accountant. When I think of some common forms of representing Jewishness.
Yeah, the accountant, the doctor, the lawyer, and the vague entertainment industry type. The producer or the agent, whatever. Those are sort of the archetypical career paths for Jewish characters. And yeah, Maisel is a great example of what I call the secular Ashkenazi New Yorker with anxiety issues. So they're generally not, deeply devout or practicing. If they're protagonists, if they're main characters, sometimes you see devout, like very, very devout Hasidic types who are minor characters who drift through the background or who have one role in an episode. But for the most part, Jewish characters are not actually doing all that much to practice Judaism. By and large, Jewish characters are New Yorkers, even though many of us live in other places. By and large, almost exclusively Jewish characters are framed as descendants of Eastern European Jews, either Eastern European immigrants to the US from the big wave of Russian immigration from 1880 to 1910, 15-ish, or they are Eastern European immigrants post-Holocaust who have, a more immediate Holocaust trauma to contend with in their lives, even though Jews don't only come from Eastern Europe. My mother's family is Libyan, for example. But when was the last time or the first time you saw a Libyan Jew in a movie or a TV show? And Jews are often depicted as neurotic. They have anxiety issues. They see therapists. They've got all this trauma that they're trying to process. And although I know people like that, that is certainly a type that exists in the real world. It's a fairly narrow range of depictions. And to me, this was problematic in ways that I couldn't initially articulate. When I was just coming out of college, I wanted to be a filmmaker, and I was all anxious about what kind of career I would have and how I should, start pursuing it. No idea what to do. And a friend of mine sat down with me and he said, you've been through years and years and years of Jewish education, from first grade on, basically. You know all this stuff about Judaism. You live a Jewish life. Why don't you tell Jewish stories? And I said, absolutely not. Because when I looked at the way Jews were depicted, those weren't stories that I wanted to tell. And when I was young and stupid, I didn't really see around that. I didn't really kind of recognize that I could take Jewish stories in a different direction. Many, many years later, I did end up dipping my toes into telling Jewish stories, and I discovered that there's a whole range of possibilities of what stories I could tell, and I didn't necessarily have to tell the same type of stories that everybody was telling. I should add Holocaust victims or victims of persecution as another category of Jewish character that did make it onto the screen, although it made it onto the screen very late, relatively speaking, in movie history. And I didn't want to tell stories about Nebuchadnezzar Jews. I didn't want to tell stories about victims. I didn't want to tell stories about Jewish characters that didn't reflect the people I knew in my circles and in my life. Also, I wanted to tell, I was bitten by the bug when I saw Jurassic Park. That was what made me want to be a filmmaker. So I wanted to make these big adventurous stories. I wanted to dive into genre. I wanted to do the fun stuff. I wanted to entertain. I didn't want to educate. Ugh. Um, but when I started realizing I could entertain through Jewish narrative, my what's the word, gateway drug, um, was the golem, which is a creature from Jewish folklore. Um, Everybody is suddenly frozen, and I want to make sure that I'm not. Okay, look, we're back. So the golem is a creature from Jewish folklore that it's an Eastern European myth that has made it into popular culture at various points in history. There was a very popular golem film in Germany in the 19 teens. It was actually a trilogy, although only one of those films has survived. There's even a golem in one of the Simpsons episodes. It's kind of everywhere. And so I started by trying to make a little golem movie of my own. It's not very good. You probably will never see it, which is okay. But it got me intrigued about, well, can I do something different with this whole Jewish narrative thing? I wrote a screenplay a bunch of years back that's a dystopian action adventure inspired by the Exodus story about a band of Jewish refugees who are fleeing through a desert, trying to hold on to their, religious and cultural heritage on their way to a boat that's going to take them across the sea to freedom. And that screenplay got some good attention, fell into the hands of a producer who was excited about it, and he tried to get it into the hands of a production company. There was a big production company in Europe, in France, that was very interested, and we were talking about, at the time it was a $1.2 million budget and filming in Morocco, and very exciting conversations. But this production company had exactly one note. And I imagine you can guess what that note was. They said, "This is really great. We're really excited about it. We want to make this movie, but can you make it not Jewish?" In a story that's all about a bunch of Jews holding on to their identity. So I said no, and the project fizzled. But it really got me frustrated. I didn't understand why anything had to why did it have to be not Jewish? And I started asking friends of mine out in Hollywood, here's what happened. Why do you think this happened? Different people had different theories, but the sort of general assumption was, well, if people perceive it as a Jewish movie, only Jews will want to see it, and there simply aren't enough of them. Now, it's true there are not very many Jews. We make up, 2% of the US population, maybe a little less. But the idea that only Jews would see a Jewish movie was weird to me. More than just Catholics, or Italian Catholics, to be even more specific, went to see The Godfather. You didn't have to be Maori to see Whale Runner. That was the example I used at the time, or Moana. It shouldn't be a thing. And unfortunately, that was a fairly common perception in Hollywood, that stories about Jews that did not fit Hollywood's definition of what a Jewish story is were niche content for a really, really tiny market. And I really, really wanted to disprove that. So I decided, what, I'm gonna make a genre movie. It's a swashbuckler. It's a pirate film. Now, I had no money, no resources, so I couldn't have the big grand, naval battles or sword fights or any of that stuff. But I tried to make an actual pirate film as best as I could. That was also unapologetically Jewish. There's no getting around. The Jewishness of it is not incidental. It's not a joke. It's not like, when I told people I was making a Jewish pirate movie, they thought it was like a Mel Brooks film. They thought it would be like a bunch of pirates saying "oi" instead of "ar." But that's not what I did. I made it as authentic as I could, and happily, it went on to play at 50 film festivals all over the world, including in places like Macedonia and even Morocco. Places that used to have big Jewish communities, but hardly have any anymore. It's played in small town festivals in Utah and South Dakota. It crossed all of these perceived barriers that Hollywood thought it wouldn't be able to cross, that Hollywood thinks still that a Jewish story wouldn't be able to cross. And that got me on this journey of telling these stories. Now, I was just trying to tell a pirate story that brought in this Jewish element. But when I screened it in LA, at one point somebody came up to me and was very, very grateful that I had put a Sephardi character on screen. Now, for those who don't know, a Sephardi Jew is a Jewish person whose ancestry goes back to the Jews who were expelled from Spain during the Spanish Inquisition. Sephardi Jews tend to have slightly different traditions, slightly different ways of speaking in Hebrew. Some Sephardi Jews have a tradition of speaking Ladino, which is the language that you heard the captain speaking with the stowaway. It is a sort of hybrid language between Spanish and Hebrew, in the way that Yiddish is a hybrid between Hebrew and German. And when he said that, it occurred to me that I hadn't seen Sephardi characters on screen before. And it got me thinking about all the other types of Jewish characters that I hadn't seen on screen before. And that's really what got everything started. So that was my really, really long answer to your very short question.
Hi, I'm Will.
Will.
My first question for you is, how do you balance telling culturally specific stories while also still making them accessible to a large audience?
That's a great question. I'll tell you where the tension lies. When you're telling a culturally specific story, you can think of your audience and your purpose in two ways. One way to think about it is you are creating something that can be a mirror for people of that culture to see themselves on the big screen. That's a really, really powerful thing. When I see a movie that I feel somehow reflects me in an authentic way, I find it deeply, deeply moving. The trouble with mirrors is that when you're reflecting somebody in all their intricacy and detail and nuance, the people who aren't reflected in that mirror might not get it. It might not resonate with them. And so the other strategy you might approach with is to create a window. And some of you might be nodding your heads saying, oh yeah, windows and mirrors, we've heard this before. But it's a very real consideration. When you're creating a window onto a culture, you're creating something that's meant to explain a bit more, that needs to explain a bit more, that needs to maybe water things down a little bit, or sometimes you're creating a character who's like the guide character, who's also the fish out of water in that world, to give your other characters an excuse to explain what's going on. Windows are also very important, especially for very small minority groups, like Jews. Most people in the world probably have never met a Jewish person. We tend to be a little overrepresented in academia in some ways. So if you're in a university like University of Connecticut, you probably have met a Jewish person. But go out beyond those bubbles, we're pretty rare. And so these windows, creating opportunities for people to kind of peek into our world and get to know us a little bit as real, first of all, and dimensional and complex and interesting. That's really, really important. But, for mirrors, you want the detail and the richness and that authenticity. For windows, you want something that translates. And those two goals can come into conflict. It's very, very tricky to balance those. In my own work, I try to use authenticity as color. So the stories that I tell at their sort of fundamental core are very universal. And the authentic elements are there to give some dimension and depth to that universal story. So, in the pirate film, I imagine for many of you, when the captain is reciting this blessing over the wine, you don't know the words he's saying. But I figure that's okay, because the whole point is, here is this pirate revealing something of himself, revealing that he's part of this very kind of specific culture, and specifically revealing it to the stowaway, who we know is from this culture because it's his cup. You don't need to know what it means for it to have some resonance. My favorite example of this is the baptism scene from The Godfather, where, I'm not Catholic. I've never been to a baptism. I kind of don't know what happens at a baptism, except that there's water involved. But I know it's a kind of big life event for a family. In this case, it involves a baby. So, new life, new hope, all this stuff, being initiated into the fold. And that baptism scene is presented, cutting back and forth with, a mob boss murdering all his rivals, in gruesome and bloody ways. And so I don't need to understand Latin. I don't need to understand the details of that scene. The details are there. They don't bother me because the heart of the story is something I can understand. So it's not alienating, it's enriching. So that's kind of where I try to go, is to figure out ways to infuse the Jewishness into a story around a more kind of universal human narrative, to deepen it, if that makes sense.
Hi, I'm Leah.
Hello, Leah.
So speaking of reaching larger audiences, you expanded your story told through your film into a graphic novel. Now, what challenges did you face in adapting your creative process from filmmaking to comic book writing?
Oh, this was an interesting one. So I finished the film, and I had in mind, as one should, an idea for an expanded story, like a feature film or something. Unfortunately, Hollywood is a giant, container ship, and so turning it takes a long time. And I'm not even a tugboat. I'm like a little rowboat trying to change the direction of this container ship. So it was hard to find anybody who felt that Jewish pirates would, be a smart marketing move. So I started looking for other ways to expand the story. And at the time, I had some friends who worked in comics. I started reaching out to them and saying, hey, how does this whole comics thing work? I'd heard that graphic novels were getting to be kind of a big deal. I connected with a friend of mine, Josh Edelglass, who I didn't know he was an illustrator until he posted an illustration on Facebook right around when I was exploring this comics thing. So I reached out to him and asked him the same question, told him about some of my ideas. He really sparked to the pirate thing. So we put together a pitch. Now, for the pitch, he did sample pages based on my short film script. And we took the short film script, a little outline of what the full story would be, and the sample pages, and got ourselves a book agent, and the book agent got us a publisher. Now, the problem with this process is that when I signed that book deal, I had never written a comic before, and I had no idea how to. So I signed the book deal, and then I panicked and realized I had to teach myself how to do this. Josh recommended a couple books. I asked some other comic book friends to send me some of the scripts they had written. And it turns out that there aren't really any rules. Everybody kind of does it a little differently. It's very different than screenwriting, which tends to be very structured, both in terms of story and also in terms of just the format of the page. There's a certain font you use, there's a certain type of spacing, there's a certain way you lay things out. With comics, it's much more open-ended. But to my relief, there were plenty of comics writers who wrote their books in a format that's very similar to a movie script. So I felt like, all right, I'm at least on the same continent. Adapting my writing style to comics required less of a jump than I thought it would, because comics is still fundamentally a visual medium. And writing comics is still not creating the end product. When you're writing a screenplay, that's not the end product. It's something for somebody else or a big group of somebody else's to use in order for them to create the end product, which is the movie. A comic book script is similar. You're writing, I mean, in this case, it felt like I was writing a really, really long letter to the illustrator saying, "Dear illustrator, here's the story I have in mind. Here's what I want it to look like." And kind of going page by page, panel by panel, describing what I imagine on the page. One of the things I decided for myself early on was that I had to consciously figure out what was different about the medium that would in a way that would change the storytelling. What happens when you're looking at a page? Really, it's actually when you're looking at a two-page spread. When you're looking at the inside of a comic book, how is that different than watching a movie? And the thing that I came up with, and I certainly didn't invent this. I've seen other people talk about this, since I thought of it, is that when you're watching a movie, the process of moving the story forward is out of your hands. The movie has to keep your interest, but if the movie loses your interest for a split second, the movie keeps going, and it might pick your interest up again. With a book, your reader needs to turn the page. The story will not continue if your reader does not turn the page. And so I made a point of trying to pay attention to, when I was writing, describing the pages, paying attention to what page is on the left, what page is on the right, and making sure that that bottom right panel on the right side page always posed some kind of narrative question. How will a character respond? What will a character do? It's not quite as extreme as a cliffhanger, but it always had to pose some kind of question that could only be answered with the page turn. And it changed a little bit the rhythm and the flow of the storytelling. It made it a little bit more. It made it in some ways a little bit more propulsive, but it also, because I knew I was building towards that page turn, every two-page spread could be its own kind of contained narrative. And this is something I developed later after this book, but the idea that when I'm writing, I'm not just writing one page at a time. I'm writing a two-page spread at a time, so that each two-page spread builds towards this question, and then the next page begins with some kind of answer to that question, hopefully a surprising one, which opens up another question or builds towards another question at the bottom right, and on and on and on to keep those pages turning. That was probably the biggest difference. Beyond that, a story is a story, characters are characters, narrative arc is a narrative arc. I apply the same kind of structuring approaches to my comics writing as I did do to screenwriting.
Well, I'm very into storytelling, so like
Oh, good.
I think it's really important to know about that. So what got you into storytelling in the first place, and how did you end up doing filmmaking and writing?
Um, I used to answer this question with Jurassic Park, which I mentioned earlier. I mean, I was 10 years old. My family didn't go to the movies all that much, but I was hanging out with a friend, and it was a Sunday morning and we were bored. And, this was one of those fancy friends who had an au pair. And the au pair said, "Why don't you go see that dinosaur movie?" And I thought, dinosaur sounds cool. So we went to see this movie and we sat near the back of the theater and I watched the entire movie like this. And at the end, it said directed by Steven Spielberg. And I thought to myself, gee, that name sounds really familiar. Um, and I went and looked him up and I saw he made all these movies I loved and he made movies that I'd heard of but hadn't seen. And just clearly, this was somebody who knew how to make movies. It was sort of the first time I gave any thought to the people who create these things. And Jurassic Park had such an impact on me. It was so transportive, that I very quickly decided that I wanted to wield that kind of magic. More recently, I realized that my passion for storytelling must have started earlier. I have these vague memories of, I think it was kindergarten or first grade, where we were given these big pads of paper and there was like one line at the bottom. We were supposed to like write a bit of a story and then illustrate it on these big pads of paper. I couldn't tell you what those stories were about. I think they usually involved jets and tanks and some kind of battle scene. And then in third grade or second grade, in second grade, I remember we had some creative writing stuff that we had to do, and I wrote a whole story. And then our whole class was sent to the fourth grade, and we were supposed to read our stories to the fourth graders. And to this day, there are people in that fourth grade class who will occasionally find me and tell me that they still remember how this little second grader came up and told them this amazing story. I don't know that the story was all that amazing, but I was clearly telling stories from a very, very young age. I don't know where it came from. I don't know why I do it. I do know that it's something that I feel if I didn't do, something would be terribly wrong with the world, or with my role in it. And as for how did I get into screenwriting and all that, really a lot of it was, growing up in Massachusetts, there weren't all that many film people around. And I wanted to make movies. So, if I wanted to make a short film, I had to write that short film. I also had to shoot and edit. And, for some of my early films, I even scored the music and kind of went soup to nuts, and did everything that I could in order to direct. And for a long time, I resisted calling myself a writer, even though I was writing a lot of these stories. I wanted to just be a director. But after a while, I was directing all this stuff and trying to think how else can I break into the industry. And a producer friend of mine said, you write well. Why don't you write stuff? Why don't you write features? Try to get them sold, try to get them off the ground. And so that's when I started. My first feature screenplay was an experiment just to see if I could write it. I did manage to get to the end. I hope nobody ever reads that thing. It's atrocious. But subsequent screenplays started to feel better and feel right. And I could tell some of the stories that were intriguing to me that nobody else was writing. And that's how I fell into it. And I've written a bunch, and now with comics and graphic novels. And a couple of years ago, I tried to write a novel just to see how that would go, and it went okay. So now that I'm back living in Massachusetts and not surrounded by Hollywood people who understand all this stuff, when people ask me what I do, I tell them I make stuff up for a living. And it's not inaccurate.
I want to acknowledge one of our YouTube viewers, YS Miller 4109, who echoing back to the short film, commented, the biblical motif of the not stolen goblet. And that is a great reminder to anyone else on YouTube. Please do not hesitate to add your questions for Arnon into the chat. We will integrate them into our discussion today. But our next question will come from one of our co-hosts.
All right, so my second question for you is, how can filmmakers and creators ensure representations are accurate and true, especially if they are trying to represent identities, people, or cultures that they do not belong to or know a lot about?
All right. This is a complicated question because as important as authenticity is, it does occasionally come into conflict with storytelling. I'll give an uncontroversial example first. When I was making the pirate film, I was working, actually, I hired a bunch of people from a pirate reenactment troupe. Partially because I knew if I hired them, they'd come with their own costumes, which turned out to be the case. They also had a lot of props. And among other things, they had lots and lots of swords. So they brought a whole bunch of swords, and we were trying to figure out which sword is the captain going to hold, when he's coming up on deck and encountering the stowaway for the first time. And they showed us a bunch, and these pirate guys, they're very into their history. They're very into authenticity. And so they said, here are a bunch of swords, but if this film is taking place in the 16th century, especially in this part of the world, in this part of the 16th century, then this sword is, this came into vogue like a half century later. This sword is too early. So this is the right sword for the film. I looked at the swords. The sword that came into vogue, a half century later just looked cooler. And so we use that. So it's an inaccurate sword. There's a lot of other accurate stuff in the film, but the sword is inaccurate. It's inauthentic. And I think for something like that, that's okay. It serves the story. The film is not meant to be a history lesson. When it comes to authenticity and the depiction of people who are not like you, first of all, everybody is not like you. And this is something that we sometimes kind of struggle to wrap our minds around. There is nobody who is you. And so every character that you create, you're trying to invent a humanity for them. And part of what that requires, part of what it demands, is making sure that your characters are doing the things that they're doing for real reasons. And where authenticity comes into this, where kind of cultural authenticity, let's say, comes into this, is that the real reasons that a Jewish character might do stuff, I'm using Jewish very broadly. There's lots of types of Jewish, and you should kind of figure out what type of Jewish it is. If a Jewish character is doing stuff, the reasons for it, the real kind of authentic human reasons for it, might be a little bit different than the reasons you would do that same thing. So as you are diving deep into your characters' backgrounds and trying to figure out who they are and where they come from and what makes them tick, I would say that's where you want to make sure the authenticity is really real. are the culturally specific drivers for these characters in place? Do you understand them enough? Do you understand them enough to understand how this character moves through life? In many cases, that might require finding somebody who is in some ways similar to your character and talking to them about it. It's not always easy. Sometimes it can be kind of awkward. But it helps. That awkwardness itself can be an informative thing. I about a year and a half ago, I worked on a screenplay, supernatural adventure story with an Ethiopian Israeli protagonist. Now there's a fascinating history of Ethiopian Jews who were a Jewish community for somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years, which means that they developed separately from the more kind of rabbinic Judaism that evolved in the 2nd and 3rd century. So they have a whole different way of doing Jewish, a whole different way of being Jewish that is completely authentic to them. And so when I was writing this character, I really wanted to understand what are all these traditions? What is this way of life? What are these ways of thinking? I managed to find, there's a woman in New York who runs a kosher Ethiopian cafe. I went to New York and she was willing to sit down and have a conversation with me. She was somewhat wary of the conversation. And in the conversation, and I wasn't sure why. I thought, well, I'm making an effort here to like try to paint an authentic picture. She explained something to me that I thought was really important. She said, the way that I was describing things, and even the way I described them to you just now, the idea that these Ethiopian Jews have a different way of practicing Judaism, it presumes something about what is different and what is not different. What is the norm and what is the other. And they don't see it that way necessarily. They don't see their way of doing things as being different. They see our way of doing things as being different. And it's not to say that there's anything wrong with difference, but recognizing from your character's perspective what is different and what is not is really, really important. I had another conversation with a Ethiopian Israeli community leader in Israel. And I sent him my screenplay and I wanted his, honest take on it. And he said that, he read the screenplay. He was very, very pleased with the way it handled the Ethiopian parts of its subject matter. And he said he was relieved because, first of all, Ethiopian Jews have hardly ever been depicted on the big screen. And when they have, it's always been as these are the sort of impoverished Black other people who had to be rescued from their home country because of persecution, and not dealing with them as sort of fully formed characters with a full and complex history and who come from their own set of experiences. And he said that, the first person I talked to, part of the reason she was probably skittish to talk to me is that all of these movies have, diversity consultants or whatever who they talk to, and none of them did a good job with it. None of them actually used that to develop the characters. And when he said that, this is sort of straying a bit from the question, but it reminded me of a time when I was a Jewish consultant on a short film. I was asked to be a consultant on a short film many years ago in LA. And it was a cute little script. And there was this moment where the protagonist did something, the protagonist, who's a devout, religious Jewish character, did something that no religious Jewish character would ever think to do. It was meant to be this sort of private, prayerful moment where she's kind of having this existential crisis. But I told them, this is a really beautiful moment, but it's not real. There are a million other things this character might choose to do in order to reach the same emotional point, but she wouldn't do this. That was my one note to them as their consultant. And they totally ignored me. They said, no, it's a beautiful moment. All right. So I saw the film, and, for people who don't know that, that this is not something that would ever be done, sure, it was a beautiful moment. But it didn't paint an accurate picture. It didn't paint an authentic picture. It did a disservice to the character, because I think if the character had chosen to do something authentic, it would have been more interesting. It would have been richer. It would have had more depth. But consultants have no power unless the people who hire them grant them the authority to be able to say, you know what, there's an issue here. And so I guess this does come back around to your question. If you're creating stories about people whose heritage and background and way of doing things is different than your own, do as much as you can to put yourself in their shoes, rather than trying to imagine what you would do in their situation. Because they're not you. They have different reasons for doing things. They have different methods of working through problems. It's complex. But it's not about researching, well, what kind of food do they cook, or what kind of slang do they use. That's all kind of surface layer stuff. When you're researching, look for what drives their choices. What are they afraid of? What are they hoping for? Because those are often culturally specific, or have a culturally specific component. And that's the stuff that motivates a character and makes a character authentic.
Thank you. And as we begin to wrap up, we have one final question. Do you have any advice for members of marginalized communities in general who are looking to create their own art with the goal of representing their identity?
Yes. I think there isn't really a good way to say this, so I'll say it the bad way, and then I'll try to explain myself. Don't try to represent your identity, because then you're not being an entertainer. You're not being an artist. You're not being a creator. You're, trying to send a message, but don't. Your goal should be to put yourself into your work in whatever way that you can. Because if it's your identity that you want people to see, then they'll see it if they see you. So, and that doesn't necessarily mean, like for myself, I don't necessarily need to write a story about a Jewish person in order to bring more of my identity out to the world. I could tell a story, and many of my earlier screenplays are like this, a story about a character who's struggling to find their identity, to figure out who they are. I mentioned earlier my mother's family is from Libya. My father's family is several generations Israel and Eastern Europe before that. I grew up in Massachusetts, but was born in Israel. Kind of had a foot in lots of different worlds. It's a complicated way of being. Um, and I can bring that authentically to a lot of stories. Um, it happens to be that a lot of Jewish stories are like that. A lot of, especially in the last 150 years, Jews have been kind of bounced around the planet quite a bit. So, do I have to tell a story about a Jewish character who's moved from one country to another and who has like, multiple backgrounds? I could, but I don't have to. What's more important is for me to put myself in it, to tell a great story. And when people see me, they'll start to get a bit of a bigger picture. Because ultimately, the mistake is to fall into the trap of thinking we need people to see our identity. An identity is a stereotype. An identity is a false box that you put people in to try to kind of explain them. If you want to break through to people, to connect with people, don't give them this identity. Give them you. Your world, your experiences, whatever that is, authentically tell a good story and make sure there's some piece of your soul in it. That I think will go much farther than sort of focusing on this mission of telling an identity. That's my thought of it, about it.
I'm sad that our time together is coming to a close, as it not only marks the end of a conversation where we've covered everything from your identity journey as a professional, as a Jewish person, as a creative, but also covering the journey that we see within the media landscape that, as you mentioned, is like an enormous cargo ship that moves by inches and not by leaps and bounds, and to how our other fellow creatives can parse through these complexities of what does it mean to represent authentically, what does it mean to represent diversity. I often tell my students that, and I believe in my heart, that each individual is a multifaceted gem. Our identities are intersectional. We cannot show every facet of who we are all at once. And that finding those places, and I can't put it any better and more beautifully than you did, where we bring parts of ourselves to the story, is so much richer than constructing a stereotype to represent one facet, perhaps, or two of who we are. So thank you again, Arnon, for sharing your film with us, for sharing your journey, your story, and your inspiration with all of us here in the studio, in the classroom, and on YouTube Live. It's been amazing.
Well, it's my absolute pleasure.
And I would like to thank again our co-hosts, Leah, Will, and Cam, for moderating. And a big thank you to Musavir Abra, our event producer behind the scenes, without who this does not happen. Heather Elliott Famularo, our fearless leader here in the Digital Media and Design Department. And most importantly, to acknowledge again our event co-sponsor, UConn Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life, and all our students and everyone who worked together to produce this event. Please check out not only the full 2026 lineup, which has ranged from Jewish pirates to how to work with the world's biggest brands with Rich 2, to how AI is designing our memories of the past with Dr. Jenny Kidd, and doing civic data design with Rahul Bhagava, and also our local multi-talent digital media team from Joe Young Entertainment, Joe and Robinia McKinley, who spoke to us about you can make it from anywhere. This season and the last 5 can be found online with the links being popped into the chat. And I invite you all to continue or to follow the digital media and design department on all our varied channels, and to subscribe here on YouTube and at dmd.com to see all of our great work from the department and especially from our students. There's work to be done, but if we continue to inspire and mentor our young creatives together, we can inch those cargo tankers, I don't know if it's 1 league or 1 degree at a time. Thank you so much again, Arnon, for joining us, and to everyone online. It's been fantastic. What a way to conclude the 2026 season.
Thanks, Anon.
Thank you.